Good to see you. That's your mic. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Today it's not Jiří Jaroš. Today it's Petr Návrat. I'm an urban planner, and I hope I will not damage the reputation of this amazing program that they host in camp, as Jiří was able to kind of build it and develop it to this amazing format. So excuse me for all my mistakes that I will make today. It's my great pleasure to welcome here tonight Alex Lifschutz, architect and sociologist and psychologist by training. And I maybe one of the reasons why Jiří is not here is because we have we developed some kind of relationship over time, and I was actually wondering how I met Alex, and it was a funny encounter where we had a client, a Czech client, that wanted to or still wants to build a garden village just outside of Prague. And well, the client didn't know that it's a garden village, but the master planner, which is very famous here, designed, and we told him it's a garden village, and we said it started in England, and we said, why don't we go to England? And then, I mean, obviously Ebenezer Howard is dead, and so we were looking for someone like Ebenezer Howard who came up with the idea of garden cities and garden villages. And we thought like it should be someone like Ebenezer Howard and maybe a little bit like Jane Jacobs at the same time.
But not dead.
And not dead, exactly. And I have this amazing Korean friend who's like MI5, like a secret agent who like comes with a list with different options. And Alex was the first on the list. And we landed with the client and this kind of a little entourage. And his office was the first that we actually saw. And it was an incredible experience. You will see shortly images of his office because it's a former music recording studio. And then we had this amazing presentation about the work of Alex. And that's why Alex is here, because I was really impressed. And we also have him as a juror in the international competition for the fourth quadrant of the Victory Square. So that's why he's here. But to be honest, I still don't know who he is. So who are you, Alex, actually?
Well, just before I start, can I just say this is Valentine's evening? You know that. You do know that. You're not here by mistake, I hope. And please, if you don't mind, no sex on the sofa tonight. Just please. So I'm not an architect. I didn't get my RIBA Part 3. I did Part 1 and Part 2. I started out in biochemistry. Can you hear me? Yeah. I started out as doing biochemistry, but biochemistry requires intellect, which I didn't have. It really is quite a tricky subject. It's a funny kind of, it's a sort of architecture, but of particles that are so small you can't see them. I prefer the architecture you can see. And I noticed there were a lot of girls in social sciences, so I swapped to social sciences. There were only men in biochemistry. I swapped to social sciences, and I finished that and had a good time. Didn't do very much work, had a very good time. And then one day I thought, as I was finishing my degree in social sciences, I thought, what am I going to do? Because if you have a degree in social sciences, all you could do then really was become a shrink, a psychoanalyst, a psychologist, or go into HR for a large company. And I didn't want to do either of those. And I don't actually like people who are unhappy. I much prefer happy people. So, you know, all of that was ruled out. And I just thought about architecture. And it's honestly, it is a sort of miraculous moment when you're walking along the street and you think, what am I going to do with my life? And suddenly this idea comes into your head. And architecture is a long game. It sort of started there. So that's the background. And then I went to the AA, Architectural Association, and I did my Part 1 and my Part 2 there. But I never did my Part 3, which is the RIBA qualification, professional qualification, because I started to work for Norman Foster, and I went to Hong Kong to work on a project called the Hong Kong Bank. And I was there for 5 years, and that was not a place where you could do the British qualification. When I came back, being quite lazy, I relied on my partner to provide the sort of certification for our firm, and we started our firm in 1986.
Okay, amazing. And since then, how were you able to use your social sciences kind of education, and how do you think it formed your architectural project?
I don't really know, to be honest. I think we all have a cultural background that we use, or we should use, in architecture, and social sciences provides you with a little bit of that. It provides you with a little bit of a bullshit detector, not much, but it does tell you that there are things outside the actual material concepts of architecture, that people are really the important aspect of architecture. And I've always, I hope, carried that along, and the idea that actually architecture becomes much more exciting if it's enfranchising people, when it allows people to take charge. So you provide perhaps a structure that is then inhabited and used and occupied and somehow appropriated by people to make it their own. That is the most exciting. That's the most exciting part, and maybe that comes from a social sciences background. Maybe it's just bullshit.
Okay, good. Well, we'll see on your projects in your presentation, where it, how you kind of use these skills. But before we talk more about you, we want to know who you are here. So, who of you is an architect or urban designer? Raise your hand. Okay, you see a few.
And thank you very much to those guys at the end. They're exhausted, but they came here after a long day. Thank you.
Okay, who has a social sciences background? Sociology, psychology.
Economists. Economist.
Okay. Any lawyers? Okay.
Don't be afraid. You won't be asked to come up. There's no audience participation.
Do we have any doctors?
We need one doctor in case I have a heart attack. Oh my God.
Okay, what did we miss? Any teachers? Okay.
So are the rest of you do nothing? You just stay at home?
Any engineers? Engineers. Oh, a lot of engineers. Okay, very good.
Just before we go on to the next thing, what do you do? Where are you from?
Well, I'm a planner, but I also had a kind of a longer path. I actually studied international relations and economics, and then I went to South Asia, and I worked in international development, first for a Czech NGO, and then for the German government, in kind of building capacities for public servants, especially in planning. And then I fell in love with planning, and then I went to London and studied at UCL. And then a famous architect from Prague said that I should come back, that Prague needs me, and I listened, and I came back. Then I worked here in IPR, and then I opened my planning office with a bunch of really amazing people. It's called OnPlan, and we try to help cities and neighborhoods to be better places to live. So that's what I do. Thank you. Okay, great. So we know who you are. We know who you are, and you also know who I am. So we are ready to start your lecture.
Okay, I'm going to take maybe 40, 45 minutes to talk quite a bit about housing, but also about other projects that somehow connect to housing. And there's a sort of arc to this story. I call it the architecture of time. And the reason I talk about time is that, well, to the economists in the audience, you know about investing money and forecasting how the economy is going to develop. We have to, as architects and engineers, we have to invest carbon. And, we don't have a lot left. Maybe we arguably don't have any left. Maybe we've already passed midnight and we shouldn't be investing any more carbon because of climate change. But if we're going to invest carbon, we have to make it count. We have to make sure that it's going to be last the test of time, that it's going to be suitable and adaptable and somehow useful in every possible way for as long as possible. And this is very serious. I mean, we really don't have any time. If you pick up the paper every day, you see how close we are to the precipice. So just one quote to tell you how hard it is, because the economists know. There was a very famous economist called Jaké Galbraith, American guy, and he said, forecasting economics has one role, which is to make astrology look reasonable. And that's pretty much where we are at the moment. We have no idea And what I will show you are some ideas, but we have no clear idea of where this carbon should be invested and how it should be invested, particularly in housing. So maybe we'll deal with those topics as we go through. And in terms of questions, if you really want, heckle, shout. I'm happy to stop and start.
And also, you can actually type if you're shy, if you're here, and if you're not here. I'm sure you're familiar with the app called Slido, and the hashtag is Urban Talks. So use the hashtag Urban Talks, and you can ask questions anytime. We'll get back to them after presentation of Alex Lifschutz.
Okay, I'll stand. And yes, to start with, our studios. So again, on this theme of time, on the right-hand side is the building at the front of our studios, which was built in around 1830. Nobody knows who for, but these were pattern book houses. So they were not designed by architects. They were just laid down designs by a landowner who owned the whole square. It's in a very beautiful square in West London. And behind it, in the large garden, one of the owners of the house, in about the 1880s, built some laundries. He happened to be the director of a laundry company, and he built laundry at the back, which you can see. So it occupies the whole garden. And the reason that they built the laundry there, and there were several others, is because it's in the southwest of London, and therefore the prevailing wind, which comes from the southwest generally, could dry the clothes as they were hung up after being washed. So it had a very sort of practical purpose. Later on, and that lasted about 100 years or so. Later on, the building was bought by a chap called Chris Blackwell, who had lived in Jamaica, and he came to London and engaged with the Jamaican community, and he realized that Jamaican music was very popular in London, particularly in Notting Hill Gate. And he started a company called Island Records. Do you guys know Island Records? You know about it? So all of these artists who you see there were engaged by him and his crew at the offices we inhabit. Some of them, not all of them, recorded in the basement studio, which you see on the left. And if I just go back to the previous slide, you see the chimney there, which was the old chimney of the laundry. When Bob Marley recorded Legends, in those days, you couldn't make the sound that you wanted digitally. You had to actually make the sound in reality and record it. And he wanted a lot of reverberation. So he actually recorded Legends singing up the chimney. And there's still a cable that links to the microphone at the top. So a lot of history behind this building. And then we occupied it in 2005. And what I would say is, and this is our crew, we're around 70 in London, 10 in Glasgow, and we're an employee ownership trust, so the employees have effectively control of the whole company. We became a trust about 4 years ago, and we are really interested in all kinds of architecture. And I suppose one of the extraordinary things about architecture in a small or a medium-sized practice like ours is that you can do everything. If you went to a doctor and said, I've broken my shoulder, and could you have a look at that? But at the same time, I've got a knee problem because I went skiing and I fell over. They wouldn't be able to deal with it. They'd send you to 2 different places. Architecture, I mean, we still have that ability to deal with all sorts of different projects, all kinds of different concepts, and that's a really extraordinary power. It's a magic power, actually. So we do a lot of very different projects. And in terms of housing, we do projects on all different scales. So this is a very small project, 6 houses, that we did for ourselves. So we wanted to trial some ideas out. We found a piece of land near our office, and we put 6 houses on it. You can see them from the station. You can see them just poking up, and they've got these tall chimneys, which are part of the heat recirculation system. And they're quite modern, but they're not completely contemporary, as they have pitched roofs, and they fit into a conservation area next to listed buildings, and they have a communal garden. And one of the concepts, I think, that is really important in this idea of investing carbon in the future is the concept of sharing. And in this case, the garden, or the area for garden, wasn't big enough, really, for separate gardens. And we felt very strongly that we should unite all the gardens so that everybody had a communal garden and shared it. And that's worked out very well. And the people who rent it, and we still run it, it's a business of ours, the people who rent it enjoy the fact that they can talk to their neighbors, that they meet their neighbors, they have dogs of every kind of size you can imagine, and somehow, and children, by the way, and they all meet in these gardens and talk. And I would just say to you, we get around 20%, 25% more rent than any of the buildings in the area, because it's clean, it's modern, there's low energy costs, and because there's this communal feel. So it's a case of trying out ideas a little bit for ourselves and then applying them elsewhere. And this concept of sharing will come up again and again. One of the things that came up in our jury deliberations today was whether you could have terraces on blocks of flats which are green, and whether you could actually maintain them. Well, we did it here. All of these terraces are planted with, as it happens, with griselinia, and they're all irrigated from a central system. So although the people rent the properties, we maintain the terraces on all these 6 houses. So that's a very small project, very nice project, and it was built 5 years ago. Roughly at the same time, just a little bit earlier, we got a project of a completely different size. This is Barking Riverside. This is a huge tract of land, about 170 hectares, in East London, on the river, facing south, which had been the site of the close to the site of the Ford Dagenham factory, not actually the site. You can see on the bottom picture, it was the site of a power station. So there's a lot of infrastructure there, a lot of contamination. And a lot of soil was brought there from other parts of London, from digging tunnels and digging infrastructure projects. And there's a mound in the middle of the site, which is about 13 meters high. So we did a master plan. This is staggeringly large. It's 11,000 homes, and then obviously shops and offices and so on. And it all relied on a new railway line, which you can just see a loop of that railway line coming in. And we did that project in a wilderness. And this happens very often in London, that you start from scratch with a completely new development. Perhaps, Peter, if I'd have been doing this project, you might have been more impressed. But anyway, so this is a staggeringly large project. We did the first phase of it, and it moves on, and the railway line is now in, and it's moving forward. There's a lot of lessons to be learned from doing these large projects about critical mass, about how you create enough substance at the beginning to get people to move in. And even though that project was really well situated, the absence of transport is a killer. You've got to have decent transport. You can't even get off the ground. And actually now the railway line is in, it's picking up and it's moving forward, and it's becoming rather successful. This is another master plan we did of the Ferrier estate, which was probably the most notorious estate in the UK. It was a council estate built by the GLC at the time in the 70s. And at the time, people on council rents, we'll talk about social housing in a minute, people on council rents paid extra to be in this. They paid extra rent. They wanted to be in it because it was a sort of garden city of the time, very modernist, as you can see. And it was quite an idealistic estate on a piece of land that had been an airfield. So it had a boundary around it, and it was cut off from everything around it. And for a while, it worked extremely well. But then the local council and other councils started to put people into it who had come out of mental hospitals or who had come out of prisons and who had ostensibly care in the community, as it was called. There was ostensibly a program to look after them, to help them integrate and so on, but that never happened. And gradually the estate fell into disrepair. And by the time we got there in 2007, it was literally falling down. It was full of crack addicts, and it was the most criminal estate in the country. And what I'd say to you again about this business of carbon is, and I don't know if it's an Anglo-Saxon thing, there's very much a feeling that you build something, you sort of look after it, but you sort of don't, and if it doesn't survive, you knock it down and you start again. That attitude cannot obtain anymore. We have to, and I think in Central Europe, Kees will tell me about Switzerland, but when I go to Switzerland, I see even quite old buildings that are well maintained, that last the test of time because they put the investment into them. We simply cannot afford not to look after our buildings. This 1,920 homes were demolished, and we're building 5,800. Again, we built the first phase. In this case, quite sort of cute houses for the people, for the first 500 people who were on social rents, who were being decanted, taken out of the old estate and put into new houses. And you can see very many of the concepts that we would have looked at from Europe, of shared streets, of bicycles, of a lot of landscape, and the idea that this place was completely different to the concrete wilderness from before. And we put in, of the 109 hectares, only about 30 or 35 are built on. The rest is park and green routes and sustainable suds. And there are some tall buildings at the center of the complex next to the railway station, and that introduced and introduces another issue, which is if you go for density, you have to go high. And again, something we could talk about afterwards and maybe debate is the extent to which tall buildings are suitable, sustainable, maintainable. I mean, in the UK at the moment, we are having a debate about safety. Grenfell Tower, you probably know the story, burnt down, 80 or 90 people died, and there's a big debate about how to make tall buildings safe, to the extent that just now we're being asked for any building, I think, over 30 meters to have 2 stairs and 2 sets of lifts. So the idea of pressurized stairs is not acceptable. Now that puts a huge onus, a huge, again, carbon investment into a building to have 2 completely separate cores. And when I say 2 sets of lifts, that is because the second core has to have the same facility for disabled people to be evacuated. So I'm thinking, on the one hand, we want to make the safest buildings, but on the other hand, I'm thinking about a photograph I saw of a man in Bangladesh in the floodwaters holding his child up in the air to protect his child. So we have to make some kind of equation between, the ultimate safety for our people in the West and in the developed world against the impact that has in terms of the carbon that is being expended that will affect people elsewhere. I'm going to move on now very quickly to other projects. This is an office and residential project. I put this in because, we had a debate today about whether you can share commercial and residential piazzas and places. This is a small piazza in the center of town in Fitzrovia with a chapel, a grade 2-star chapel on the left with a very distinctive profile and beautiful interior, and a piazza that we made, and then we built about 5 out of the 7 buildings around, including these apartment buildings, luxury flats and affordable flats. So our model in the UK is that for every development that you make, you have to make at least 35. The ideal is 35% affordable. 40% is really welcomed, and you get a faster track through planning. So our model is that you label the dwelling as affordable. Here, I think in the Czech Republic, you give people a housing subsidy to rent somewhere, that is, to make it affordable. So it's a slightly different concept. And it's very tricky for developers in the UK to be able to afford that extra cost. Another urban project, again, mixed use, offices, residential, and also so many of our projects are retaining existing fabric. So this is New Bond Street. This is around 10 buildings in New Bond Street, and then on the other side, Hanover Square. We just finished this. Another aspect of architecture in our time and in our city is how long these projects take. So this project started in 2008 and was only just finished now. And when I was looking today at some of the people presenting, and I was saying to Martin on the extreme right, I said, if I present a proposal for a project like this that the client knows is going to take 10 or 15 years, he's going to think, this guy's going to be dead by the time it's finished. There's no point talking to him. And look, that's serious. These are seriously long-term projects. So I need a stand-in. So you can see in brown from New Bond Street all the way through to Hanover Square, we created new routes, a new little piazza there, and it's a very beautiful little project with above the Elizabeth line, above the ticket station, you can see number 8 of the Elizabeth line. So it's above a massive hole in the ground, 30 meters deep. We positioned the project above the station. We worked with the Crossrail who were building the railway, and we moved the vent shaft. You can see on the left-hand side 2 vertical shafts. We moved those over from above the station. That was a very successful move, and in return we gave them some concessions, some ability to use our site for their construction and so on. And the end result is that we got a fantastic office floor plate, and amongst other buildings, there were about 15 buildings on the site, is this wonderful building, 1820s, a house, one of the last houses surviving from the original square, and is an example of the reverse of offices being converted to housing. This is a house converted to offices. As it happens, and this is grade 2-star, so this is a pretty serious standard for heritage. As it happens, the first people to occupy it is the Jimmy Choo Academy, who provide foundation courses for people making shoes. So I haven't got a picture here, but in many of these rooms you have industrial sewing machines and cobblers' machines. And I think that's a really interesting aspect that you can't predict. So I mentioned this business about, I keep looking at you because I remember you were the economist, or one of you guys was the economist. The economists can't predict the interest rates next year, and we can't predict as architects whether somebody's going to occupy that as a house or as an office, or in this case as an educational facility. These are some of the other buildings, very big office building. And at the other end of the site on New Bond Street, the passageway through that leads you through to our building, and this rather sweet little piazza and cover in our weather. So that was just finished recently. And then we do other office buildings. This is the big one we've just finished in close to the City of London. You can see St. Paul's. And very important now, and this again has a resonance with homes, is the idea that you have to get people to leave their homes to go to work. Now, I don't know what the situation is here in Prague, but in London, in certain professions, people will just not go to the office. And they can actually say, look, you want to hire me, I'll go to the office 1 or 2 days a week. I'm staying home the rest of the time. Now, I don't know what that means for the center of town, what happens to the coffee shops, what happens to the public transport if nobody's using it. And so on this office building, we built some bicycle. Again, I've included this for the Dutch amongst us. This rather nice bicycle facility that is literally directly off the street. So instead of having a shop there, there's a vast bicycle store with over 300 bikes. Underneath it is a gym and a changing area, so you can go down, change, lockers, drying cupboards, ironing boards, sewing places, hair, all sorts of things, and then you go straight into reception. So it's literally a direct route into the reception and then up. And that is part of the idea of getting people back to the office, that you'll give them the chance to have exercise, that they will leave their home because at least they're going to get some exercise. And the other aspect, which again is mentioned quite often, is the need for terraces so that people get to see the outdoors. Just a few other projects. Hospitality, we do a lot of that. We do lots of restaurants across Europe and the UK. And university buildings. This is one we've just finished. Again, it's a student residential above laboratories for University College London. So this is in their new campus. We did their master plan in their old campus and said, if you want to expand, you have to build a new campus, and they're doing that. And this is the first building there, which is rather interesting. The one on the right. On the left is a building by Stanton Williams, another one for them. And then we do other stuff. On the right, Kotva. We did a scheme for Kotva here in Prague to make into a department store. And we do quite a few department stores and then retail and so on. A couple of other projects here, more in the cultural sector. The one on the right is a community centre, and it's really quite a popular one. It's about 220,000 people visit this little community centre on the Finchley Road called JW3. And then on the left, an extraordinary building for a client who it turned out was a neighbour of mine who owned a company called Bonhams. Bonhams is an auction house, and we built this auction house which sells motor cars, it sells modern and classic art, it sells sculpture and so on, and it also sells pieces of the Apollo rockets. So again, a building that has to work very hard to sustain itself. And then we do a lot of public realm projects, and that's very important to connect communities. So on the left, our project called Illuminated River, which we did with an artist from New York called Leo Villarreal. This is about lighting London's bridges, the Central 9 bridges, with art. And we won that in a competition about 4 or 5 years ago and finished it last year. And then on the right, a public realm project to open up the river. So this is, on the left is a railway bridge, and on the right, a very famous bridge, Westminster Bridge. And this is the start of a campaign we launched to turn the lights off in cities. Now, you don't have that problem in Prague, but in London, every single shop has the lights, turned up full to compete with the next shop. But here I notice you're a bit more civilized. Well, in many ways, you're much more civilized. And then infrastructure projects. On the left is a bridge that we proposed across the river at the barrier, which is an opening and closing bridge. And on the right, one that we built a few years ago in Docklands. Now, the other thing about architecture, which I think is very inspirational, is not only that you can tackle many different kinds of projects, but that you can also propose projects. And you can identify things that you think need fixing. And I think this is, if we have to free ourselves from the tyranny of clients and of money and of the day-to-day grind of being architects and designers and engineers, maybe the way to do it, one of the ways to do it, is to imagine the world as it should be and to propose the projects that would make it the way you want it. And we've done that several times, and we've managed to then launch those projects and get the funding and get them started. It's very hard to do, but it does make you feel empowered. Okay. Quick switch to Prague and London. Just to give you a bit of context, I've mentioned the social housing framework. In London, 50% roughly are owned homes, 25% are rented in the market, and 25% are social rented. Here in Prague, I think it's more like 55% are owned, around 30% are rented, and then I think there's a small number of what you call co-op flats. So it's a slightly different structure. Our density is twice yours. So we are 5,000 people roughly per square kilometre, and you're 2,500. So there are similarities, but there are also differences. One thing that's very important is the way in which the population grows or changes. And that's something we've tracked a lot in London. And I put this up from this graph up from 1985 through to now, and you'll see that London, on the face of it, and Prague are the same, but it's a sort of bullshit graph, because you can see on the left in London we've gone from about 6.5 million in 1985 to about 9.5 million today, whereas you've grown very small amount, 1.2 million to about 1.3 million. It's just scales are very different. Now, why is that important? It's important because we have huge pressure, huge pressure. Our growth is 30% in 20 or 30 years, huge pressure on housing. And another slightly strange graph of age and the way in which the population is changing. So my generation, which is baby boomers, I'm not going to reveal exactly where I fall on this, but I'm male. I self-identify as male, and I'm towards the top left of that graph. And you can see there's a big wide sort of histogram between 30 and 39 is the widest in London. And here, this is slightly confusing because it's upside down. In Prague, it's the biggest is 30 to 39. So very similar age profile to London. And what's the issue with that? Well, the issue is in Prague and in London, many old people, like me, own apartments or houses where their children have left and are under-occupying them. So to give you an example, in London, 1/3 of all dwellings are under-occupied, and the definition of under-occupation is 2 rooms or more are not used. And I was talking with Peter this morning, and it does seem it's the same in Prague. Now, I mentioned the issue of sharing. If we're going to keep the carbon that we use to its best advantage, we're going to have to find a way around that. And there's some ideas, again, we could debate with you about how you encourage people like me to move off their big apartments, move out of their big apartments, and give space to people like you, especially the ones on the sofa. I think the ones on the sofa get special privileges, or maybe, yeah, okay, we'll leave that one. So now, armed with some of that information, if we go to Coin Street, I'm going to show you 2 case studies in a little bit more detail, if you can stand it. Let me just see the time. Enough time, yeah? I mean, you can leave if you want. If you've got the best excuse. I'm sorry, I've got a Valentine's dinner. I've got to go. On the left, in about 1981, 79, 80, 81, which is why I showed you that graph, is a piece of the South Bank, which is, how can I describe it? It's a piece of London that was forgotten. It was very much a working class area. It had docks, it had printing works, it had industrial, very heavily polluting industrial works. There was an ice cream storage warehouse there. There were a lot of other warehouses. And on the right is a picture later on in around 2005. And we've been working in that area for 1 or 2 clients. The main client is Coin Street Community Builders. And they are a not-for-profit, a very extraordinary not-for-profit that recognized that there was a problem with this part of London in the 1980s. And we started working for them in 1989. And people really did look like this. This isn't that long ago, but look at how people looked. I mean, you know, there you go. And you can see the placard that says, "Save our schools." And the one thing that people care about, more than even than housing, is their children and schools. And we started working there for Coin Street on a building called OXO. And there were many issues. There was a lack of social infrastructure, housing, affordable housing, work. And Coin Street invented 2 concepts. 3 actually. One was social housing, their form of social housing. The second was their form of work. And the third was their form of cross-subsidization. How to make, in a not-for-profit, how to make enough surplus to then reinvest. So these are some of we've done around 20 or 30 projects there. Some very small ones like playing fields or sports pitches, temporary nursery, toilets for a market, those sorts of projects, but also bigger projects. And I'll describe some of them. OXO, you can see, is on the extreme left, bottom left. I'm going to talk a little bit about number 1, which is the tower, and number 5. And also, actually, where is it? Number 7. So just starting with OXO, they owned so they bought the land. It's 13 acres of land, so it's about 4 hectares of land. They bought from the council, because they were not-for-profit. They raised money in an extraordinary way, and they paid off the debt with a car park. I mean, just extraordinary people. And they, as part of the land that they bought, was this really extraordinary building called Oxo that had been built in the 1880s sort of thing, but more or less the same time as our offices. And it had been a power station for the post office. So at that time in the UK, there were big corporations, the post office was one of them, and they had to generate their own power. So this was a power station. Later on, it became a meat warehouse. And then a company that made the Oxo meat cube bought the rights to put the tower on the top, because at that time there was no, you couldn't advertise any, there was no advertising on the river, so they chose to make this, this concrete shell with the word Oxo in the windows. And then it was, as I say, a meat warehouse, which was very disastrous for the structure because the meat, the preparation of the meat involved chemicals that leached into the concrete. And they also made something called endless eggs. Does anyone here know what an endless egg is? No? I won't, don't worry, I won't call you up. But if you ever had a pie in England, has anyone had a pie in England or here? Yeah? No, no pie. Okay. So when you cut into the pie, have you not been curious that every piece has an egg that has the same amount of yolk and the same amount of white? So this fucking company made eggs, reconstituted eggs into long sausages that they could put into pies. So that's the kind of absurd almost end of this building until Coin Street bought it. And then we converted it into a mix, a vertical mix of different uses, from apartments in the middle, co-op apartments, to this new kind of work, designer maker work, and at the top, a restaurant. A huge restaurant, 400-seat restaurant. And I remember at the time talking to the client and saying, well, it's a bit risky. And he said, fuck it, we'll do it. Let's just do it. And I can tell you that no commercial company would have done it. But this is the benefit of working with local people, with working ground up. And the curious thing is that they're much less risk averse. I mean, they're not stupid, but they're less risk averse. This restaurant had been successful for the last 25, 30 years, since it opened in 94, I think, so 30 years nearly. And it cross-subsidizes the other activities. So if you live in one of these flats, you can be paying rent in a week that would be the same as one meal in the restaurant. So the idea that you would have this difference between the incomes of people who can afford the restaurant and the people who can afford the flats seemed to us to be a bit, possibly a little bit dynamic. And we imagined all sorts of problems. As it happens, nobody worries about it because the profits from the restaurant, they take a rent roll, subsidize all the good work. So again, another example of a very peculiar kind of economics invented by Coin Street. And I mentioned that they invented a form of social housing. So this is co-op housing. This is one of the, we finished this scheme also in 1994. Co-op housing, where the people living in their homes run them, maintain them, pay the mortgage, and they manage the whole property. So if somebody doesn't pay their rent, it's your friends, your neighbors, who are going to have to pay more. So it has a very, very clever sort of social dynamic of how can I put it, of normative behavior to make sure that everybody behaves themselves, doesn't spoil the common parts, doesn't throw rubbish into the gardens and so on. And this actually is quite successful. It looks just like this. This is photographs taken when it was finished. This looks just the same today, and it's rather a nice development. The only issue is that it's made of wood, or there's large amounts made of wood, and we struggle at the moment. Again, another debate to have with you about timber structures. We struggle at the moment to find ways to get insurance and fire performance. This guy, Tom Keller, and his two daughters lived there at the beginning. I still know him, I still go there. He doesn't look like that anymore. His daughters are grown up, they have their own children. And one of the things we decided to do when we won the competition for this was to design the houses very simply, very, very simply, in order to facilitate social change. So on the top, on the left, you can see, well, first of all, the house is around 6 meters wide, which means you can divide it into 2 3-meter wide bedrooms. It's got a very, very familiar plan to you with the central stair. But the ability to put 2 bedrooms or other spaces in that main plan area is really, really important, because what it allows you to do, on the left is a family, if you want, of lots of children and a couple of parents and so on. And you can see that we can divide the plan into lots of bedrooms, and there's a smaller area for the living room at the bottom. The middle plan has these drawings were done in 1992 when we won the competition, 1990 when we won the competition. In the middle is an arrangement where the kids live at home. And we knew that children lived at home because when you lived in a co-op apartment with low rent, it was really hard to move out and to find another apartment at that kind of rent. So lots of kids were staying at home with their parents. That pattern has accelerated now with the cost of housing. So in the middle diagram then, they have a loft flat, and their flat starts on the top 2 floors, and on the right is Granny and Granddad, and they're living in a completely separate flat on the bottom. Now, none of this is rocket science, all of this is pretty straightforward, but it all relies on having the right volume, height, and the right dimensions in the width. We did lots of other projects, public realm projects, and meanwhile uses. So there on the left is Gabriel's Wharf, which is a settlement of garages. We came in at the end of this project. They were bought for £50,000, which even in those days was a very small amount of money. They're concrete, prefabricated concrete garages, and they created, in this ex-industrial area, they created a sort of temporary, and it turns out 30 years on, not so temporary, environment for designer makers, for restaurants, for pubs, and so on. A very quick, instant place. And then we won a competition to design this bridge across the Thames, which was, if you want, the last piece of the puzzle, which meant that people could cross from the North Bank to the South Bank, and this underprivileged area suddenly became the centre of town. Geographically, it is the centre of town, but it had never been that. And this is now the most popular crossing of the Thames. There's about 10 million people a year use it to cross backwards and forwards. Okay, coming to the end of this case study with a project that Coin Street initiated for community facilities. So they asked people, they said, and they're very good at this, so it's again this ground-up idea that you ask people what they want and then you try and deliver it. And then that puts people behind you. So they said, what social facilities do you want? And healthcare, obviously, and that was being provided elsewhere. Library was provided. Swimming became one of the top priorities. So, and the Thames had always been a place where people swam. I'm not sure how many of them survived, but plenty of them swam. And so we designed this. Now, imagine here that you're dealing with a community, not-for-profit community organization that had built a 9-story high tower in wood at one end of the site. There was a great deal of opposition to that 9-story. In fact, it was 11 stories, but we had to reduce it to 9. And now we're proposing 43-story tower of market flats, of luxury flats, to pay for a swimming pool. And next to it is 42 apartments for co-op. And that project started in 2000. So when I say to you, you have to have some endurance and some youth to survive these projects. That started in 2000. We're still working on it. We're just about to put in our final application, and then we'll start building. And the project has a tower, which we still, again, this is an old picture, we still believe in the importance of a sort of loose fit, the ability to have different uses in that tower, because we can't anticipate what will happen, although almost certainly it would be flats. And here you see that this whole terrace is designed to be sustained by this market tower, and that will pay for the swimming pool, the sports centre, and not just that, but also a sort of long-term income to pay for what inevitably is always a losing prospect. So swimming pools always lose money. Here's some images. And we've just, as I say, we're just about to put in for that project. So when I say to you that there are different structures that are possible to create our cities and that are perhaps as inventive and as interesting as the sort of top-down model of developers and banks and institutions, this project, I think, exemplifies that. Have you got the patience for one more case study? I'll run through it quickly, and then the guys on the sofa can get busy. So the Olympics. Now, this is the complete opposite. This is the London government and the national government investing in 2012 in a huge project, the Olympic project, which it did really quite successfully. And we were very fortunate. We won 2 of these courtyard buildings, which you see on the left-hand side. We won 2 of those, and there are around 12, and we built those for the original games. They were built, this is quite interesting, the flexibility was already built in because they were built for the athletes as sort of shell apartments. So a 2-bedroom apartment, so 2 bedrooms, that would be 2 athletes, and then the living room would be another 2 athletes. So the living room had no kitchen in it. We just put a wall down the middle, and so there were no kitchens, and the finishes were very bare. So it was a bit like a sort of loft flat. And then after the games, which was, I have to say, 2012 for me was the high point. 2016 was the most dire, that's when we had the Brexit vote, was the most extraordinarily bad day. But in 2012, we had the Olympics. We also were fortunate, we and 2 other architects won the contract to do all the temporary buildings and the tents and so on. And on this site, you'll see in a minute. So these are the 2 courtyard buildings. This is the one with a white exterior and a red interior, and another one with these rather extraordinary balconies. And so the tents was another great experience of building instant facilities. This is the dining tent we built. It's 80 meters by 240, lifted in one go. And it fed 5,000 people. I mean, it's biblical. It's epic. 5,000 people at one sitting with 16 different kitchens because each of the athletes' countries had their different dietary requirements and different health requirements and so on. That was put up and taken away. And then, again, we were very fortunate. We won a contract with a developer who bought the rest of the Olympic Village. So more or less everything, can I point? So all of this was the rest of the Olympic Village, and we master planned that. They bought it, and it was an interesting master plan. We came up with the idea that these towers, we had 2,500 apartments in the first phase. Sorry, 2,500 apartments in the first phase, in the Olympic phase, sort of down here and around the side, and then another 1,850. There was an outline consent for another 1,850 apartments, which were all to be built to rent. The Olympic phase, the 2,500 apartments, were 50-50 social rented and 50% market. So we came up with the idea of some repetition, obviously in terms of carbon, in terms of sustainability. The more repetition there is, the more standardization, the less waste, the more quickly you can build. And given that people were already living here, to build another 1,850 apartments, it needed to be done well and quietly. And we built the first phase. Now, what was interesting about the first phase is, again, they needed temporary facilities. So this is a temporary relocatable supermarket, and it's very successful. It's so successful that it still hasn't moved. It's supposed to have gone, but it hasn't moved. Now, 3 or 4 exercises on these towers that I think taught us some lessons. Number 1, balconies. So I have a sort of vendetta against balconies because I've never met, if you phone somebody and say, "Hi, how are you? Where are you?" They never say, "I'm on the balcony." I mean, that's just they'd be such a fucking, they'd be trying to commit suicide if they were on the balcony. It's a completely fictitious space that was invented in the Mediterranean where it should stay. And I absolutely don't believe in it. I'm trying to be provocative, you can come back to me on it later. If it costs almost the same to build the space inside as to hang it on a balcony, and I haven't met a quantity surveyor yet who can tell me what the difference in cost is between a balcony and building a little bit more extra space. So what we're saying is, if that is the balcony and it's inside, then all you're paying for is the floor and the ceiling. You've already paid for the kitchen, you've paid for the front doorbell, you've paid for the door, you've paid for the concierge, the lift, everything is paid for except for the carpet and the floor and the soffit and maybe one light fitting. That's not a lot of money, but what it does is it makes flats that are very small. So we have rules in the UK about how big the apartments have to be, and I'm sure you have the same here. You have the same here? Yeah. So if they say two-bedroom apartment shouldn't be any smaller than 70 meters, then you know that no apartment is ever bigger than 70 square meters, so the minimum becomes the maximum. And so what we said was, on this building, we said there's no point having balconies. I mean, I live in a flat which is 7 stories up, and I have a really nice little terrace. I never go on it. It's too windy. And, it's just too hard. So it's nice to look at, but it's not very useful. But here we were saying, if you put that space on the inside for these people living in the tower, it's much more useful. And as it turns out, with COVID, it became much more useful because you can homeschool, you can do remote working, and most importantly, some of these flats are now shared. So you will get a 2-bed flat that's shared by two different people, or maybe even 2 couples. And the difference in the amenity, in the space that you get, of course you can open the window and you have a Juliet balcony. It's not that you can't feel the outside, but after 7 stories, it's really impossible to spend any time on a balcony, unless, of course, you're smoking a spliff or something you don't want anyone to smoke in. The wind will carry all the smell away. So that's one vendetta. The other one is on standardization. And we worked with a really extraordinary construction company called Mace. We needed to find a way to build these buildings quietly and with the minimum amount of disturbance. So we had these rising factories, they're called jump factories, rising up the outside of the building with these platforms that go around them. And we would load in prefabricated elements and then load them out. So about 90% of these towers is prefabricated. So vertical columns, slabs, core walls, twin walls, vertical services in the rises, horizontal services distribution, cladding, toilets, MEP cupboards, as much as possible was prefabricated because it was quiet and there were other people living around. And we were doing 1 floor every 55 hours. It's quite astonishing. When I say we, I didn't have anything to do with it, but the contractor was doing it. Okay, so that's lesson number 2. Lesson number 3 is this concept of loose fit. And a few years ago, I wrote a book with a chap called John Harbrook, and he contributed a lot. And he had initiated this conversation about loose fit. The idea that you could actually create homes that could be changed over time. And there's another chap who I'm sure you've heard of called Stuart Brand, who wrote Whole Earth Catalogue. And he wrote a book called How Buildings Learn. And he said, a building is not something you finish. A building is something you start. And that's something that stuck with me from my social sciences training. Here is our tower floor plate. And we managed to get all the services and all the structure into the core or into the external walls. So that literally you can move anything around, not that it will happen immediately, but over time it may. And you can have either an office or you can have a residential layout. And we used that when we laid out these apartments. And then the final piece of the puzzle for me is the furniture that you put into these apartments. So I really don't understand. So let me just give you an example. If I have a laptop, okay, and it's an Apple laptop and it's silver, and you have a laptop and it's black, What else can you tell me that will just distinguish between our two laptops in terms of their appearance? Yours has got, I hope it doesn't have Dell, but something like that on the front. And what else can you say? It's 30 centimeters wide. It weighs half a kilo. There's not much you can say. But if I say to you, tell me what's in your laptop, you could spend the next day telling me it's pictures of my friends, it's got my address book in it, it's got my lecture notes, whatever. And that is, for me, is the analogy of an apartment or a home or even an office. It is externally very similar. These are all 70 meters that you could lay them out. They're absolutely repetitive, but it's how you can alter the interior, how you can program what's happening inside your laptop that makes it your laptop and completely a disaster if it's lost or stolen. So we've been working on flat pack construction, so bathrooms, kitchens, made really very simply on racks and to attach to walls. This is something that you could actually, and we have tried to make locally, so that we can use local unskilled populations to actually raise their skill levels and to create prefabricated kitchens, bathrooms, cupboards, and so on. And just literally to move them into position so that you can change things around. And if I give you this example here of Bonhams, this is a second Bonhams we built, second auction house we built in Hong Kong. Literally every single, this is half an office floor plate. Every single wall in that half of the office floor plate was a movable partition onto which you could nail a picture and which had acoustic qualities, didn't have a track on the floor. It was, you could wind it into position and then it would expand onto the floor where it would provide the acoustic seal. And it was used, here you can see a couple of layouts, a reception on one side, a gallery on both sides, situated for an auction with seats or an event or a happening. There was the most flexible floor plate you can imagine. And all we used was standard off-the-peg partitions with a special finish on them. So if I just show you this apartment, so it's 70 square meters, and it's, it's maybe you can't afford a whole fit out, so you have a small kitchen, which is all that you possibly need, one bedroom and some folding partitions, or not, and one of these flat pack bathrooms. And then as your needs change, you might have a second bedroom, and the bed can fold up, and you can have your workspace there, and the partitions can move. And then the next step is where you have maybe some big storage units, like those archive storage units, and you can slide those back. So for me, it seems like it's within grasp, is the idea that you can have small apartments, relatively small apartments, that give you the flexibility, give you the freedom to work ground up and, to create your own loose fit architecture. Thank you very much.
Well done. So I hope you prepared your questions. We also have some questions on Slido. And we can move this. I feel like I should give you 10 minutes to rest now. But since we are in the middle of this beautiful exhibition on housing, you brought up a lot of topics on housing, on affordable housing, kind of different forms of housing. And I think we all feel that we have this kind of urgent need that maybe in London it's much greater than here in Prague, but we have this need of first creating a lot of housing units, but second having them affordable. So what's your secret secret recipe, or how? I mean, what shall we do? And then connect it with this kind of zero carbon attempt, or with this the climate commitment that we have.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm a big hypocrite, so we build some pretty sort of ordinary homes, and you know, we have to. There's only a certain amount you can do with the right clients. But it strikes me as it's very strange that all the apartments are always finished completely, so they have big kitchens and bathrooms, and you know, actually you don't necessarily need that. And I just wonder if there isn't a market for loft flats where you have much more minimal. You know, I would rather, you know, when I started, you know, in my first apartment, I did actually have an apartment with very little in it, but I liked the space. That was great. And I think people would pay extra for space, or certainly it would be just as attractive. So that's one way of reducing costs. So roughly speaking, 30% of the cost of an apartment, 25 to 30%, is the fit out. Well, if you could reduce that fit out to almost nothing, then you're making a big deduction. So it's things like that are really helpful. I think chasing the highest energy targets is really important, but needs to be done judiciously, because for that last 5% of energy you save, you may have to spend, as a developer or as an architect, you may have to spend a lot more. So I think it's a measured thing, and there's no magic to it. It's about being sensible, really.
And I remember, you know, when you mentioned this problem of underoccupied homes, and I mean, I know it from my personal experience here, a few blocks from here. Half of the building is empty, actually. There's 12 apartments and 6 are empty for different reasons. People died and didn't want to sell it, etc., or they live abroad. So what is what can we do about it? Yeah? So at one hand, we need housing. At the other hand, we have a lot of empty flats.
So in the UK, you have to pay money to buy a flat. It's called stamp duty. It's tax-free to sell your own flat. You get the money. You don't have to pay any tax. But then, of course, if you sell your flat or your house as an older person like me, you're thinking, this is my nest egg. This is my savings. I've just sold the house, and now inflation in the UK is, I don't know, 10 or 11%. I'm already 10% poorer. What the hell am I going to? I'm never going to sell my flat. So what happens in the UK is a lot of older folk keep their large houses. I think we had this conversation, and they can't afford to heat them, so they're miserable. They can't afford to maintain them, and they're actually just using 1 or 2 rooms. So my proposition is, if you sell your house or your flat as an older person and you want to downsize, you need 2 things. You need the government to say, and it has to be the government, we will give you a complete treasury-backed or a complete gilt-backed bond that will run at the same rate as inflation plus X, whatever X is. So inflation plus 5%. Because it's so much cheaper for the government to do that, and it's so much less carbon for the government to do that, to get you out of your flat and to liberate it for a younger family, or for 2 people sharing, or 4 people sharing. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is, we need homes. I showed you the graph of the age distribution. We need homes for people of a certain age, because, you know, my kids aren't going to look after me. I don't want them to, but I do want to stay as long as I can in my flat. Now, I broke my leg skiing 2 or 3 years ago, and I've got a flat with two levels. I couldn't move from one level to the other. So I understand now you're going to have a level floor. So we need larger flats with level floors, and we need a sort of income-backed or interest-backed bond, and then people like me will move. And then, just to repeat the statistic, there are 8 million homes in the UK, 8 million homes, the population is 67 million, 8 million homes which are under-occupied by two rooms or more. So if you said that's 16 million rooms plus, and if you said that a 2-bedroom flat is 3 rooms, that's about 5 million homes. I mean, that solves the problem. And of course, not all the homes in the right place, not everyone's going to move, but you're talking about a very large number, and it's available instantly.
I think you're the first architect who has a proposal without building anything.
Well,
yes, you do.
There's some buildings that aren't worth building, you know. Sometimes it's better just to work on the ideas. They're much more fun. No client, no budget, just ideas. Like the competition we had today. I mean, for us, it was, well, for me, it was a great education and very enjoyable. I think for most of the competitors, it was very enjoyable. They didn't have to build it, they didn't have to worry about weather protection and solar protection. That didn't matter at all.
Very good. You showed a lot of high-rises, and I think that people are not always very comfortable with high-rises. The Jane Jacobs in you, do you think we can actually create communities in this kind of high-rise setup, or are the benefits of high-rises so great that we kind of forget or trade off the loss of the community?
Well, it doesn't have to be a loss of community. You can have a sort of concierge at the ground floor. You can have a little gym or a physio or a coffee shop. I mean, you can make coffee anywhere now, good coffee, and you can have a little workspace. I don't think that the typology matters that much. I do think there's an issue with tall buildings, which is that if you've bought a flat in a tall building and it turns out it needs maintenance, it's going to be very expensive. And you're going to have to get, if let's say there are 100 people, 100 apartments in a flat, in a block, and you need to reclad the building because they put the wrong cladding on, or you just need some maintenance, change the windows or whatever. How do you get 100 people together? So one of the options, I think, is that we're going to have a system where we have to buy, we're going to have trusts to buy these properties to maintain them, because otherwise they're going to fall into disrepair. There is no system that is, I mean, it's hard enough if you live in a house which is divided into flats to agree with everyone that this year we're going to paint the house. Imagine, living with 100 people. So that is the biggest problem, maintaining them.
Okay. Well, I have a very nice question, but maybe there's more interesting questions from the audience. So we have 2 mics. If you have a question, raise your hand.
Don't worry, I won't say it's a stupid question. I'll say it's a very intelligent question.
All right, we have, I don't see any question here, but maybe I'm just, okay, we have one here. Young lady in the front, 2nd row, actually.
I have a question. When you start a new project, for example, you need a new building, how do you integrate it more smoothly to the environment you already have?
Thank you.
That's a very interesting question. That really is. So again, this is something we saw today in our competition, is that everybody has a different way of saying that they've got the right answer. And I don't know if I have the right answer, and I don't think there is a single right answer. But it does come from studying the neighborhood, looking at it, walking around it, having a drink in it, talking to local people about what are the good things, what are the bad things, is there crime? I mean, one of the very useful maps that we collect a lot of information. One of the most useful maps is a crime, the crime statistics. In London, I mean, for what it's worth, I suppose they're probably inaccurate. Each crime is recorded with a dot on a map, and it tells you what kind of crime it is, if it's muggings or horrible, I won't mention, but so you get very quickly an idea about the social fabric. That's very important. I think it's as important as the technical fabric, public transport, the other buildings and so on. So that's the start. And once you get a feel for, how a place operates, its landscape, the green landscape, the blue landscape, then automatically you sort of get a feeling for some starting points. One of the things I was very surprised in a competition today, and it's something we could talk about, is we usually start with 2 or 3 options for how we could imagine a little master plan or a little building. And then we might talk to people locally about it. We might say, well, what do you think? And they're very often much more knowledgeable about their area because they live in it and they work in it. And I found that very interesting today, that everybody presented their vision, and there were 9 architects, their vision of how this competition should be played out. And each of them had a completely obvious and sensible logic, and yet there were 9 different, more or less, or let's say 7 different schemes, more or less. So I find that very interesting. And I think, so you need another level to test. It's not good enough just to say, well, I'm an architect and I know how to do this, and I'm, you need to find some other kind of sounding board, maybe the experts that they had today, maybe local people. Those are some of the ways in which you can start to get a feel.
Is it related to the character of the architect, to his ego, perhaps?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Next question. Here in the front.
Thank you very much for sharing your path and your personal story. You brought up the notion of really strict and crucial regulations that sacrifice affordability and construction efficiency for the sake of safety, in case of fire safety in the UK. And you also brought up the bouwgroepen environment of your beautiful co-living that you developed and the non-profit community-driven project. So I would like to synthesize the two and ask for your socio-political take on the potential self-regulating community project with the eyes on the construction site of a certain group or a cooperative. If you do believe that even when it comes to such crucial regulations that are usually state-imposed and nationwide imposed, do you believe that the cooperative like that could regulate itself in this case?
Well, it does at Coin Street. It certainly does. So I have a friend who lives in a council house he's a very senior planner, and after Grenfell, I was talking to him about it, and he said, it doesn't surprise me. He said, I live in this council flat, and I've lived here for 20 years, and every week or second week or third week, somebody comes along and says, I've been told to do this, and they fix a pipe or they add a piece of electrical circuitry, and nobody's supervising them. Nobody has any idea what they're doing, and he has no authority to challenge them. And the problem with Grenfell was that over time, extra bits and pieces were added by tenants, by the management company, and nobody actually had a picture of what was happening to the building. So the short answer to your question is, you have to learn how to manage your own building. And I'll give you the example, if you want, of how it's done at Coin Street. And you have to take responsibility for it. I don't believe that a third party, a landlord, has the same interest as you do. And so when it comes to safety, there is a discussion. Look, I don't know the answer. I'm not telling you this. But if you say you need 2 stairs and 2 sets of lifts, and it's going to cost more, so we're going to build fewer flats, there are going to be fewer social housing, there are going to be more people who are homeless, and the guy in Bangladesh with his baby, then I'd say, well, but what would it take not to do that? And the answer is, well, if you looked after the stair, if you made sure the doors were closed, that you weren't storing bicycles and... We had a fire in London where they had mattresses stored on a balcony, and the balcony below, they had a barbecue. I mean, you need to understand the basic principles. So the answer is intelligence, management, supervision can compensate for fixed structures. And building 2 sets of stairs that are both blocked is no better than building 1 set of stairs that's properly supervised. So that's I don't know if that's an answer.
No, thank you. But would you believe that this cooperative supervision could be sometimes even higher than the state regulation?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So on Coin Street, we have housing committee, so we have to present to them, and they ask us questions like, well, how do I clean the windows? They're very high. How do I clean them? And who's going to maintain the cladding? What does it take to maintain the cladding? How much is it going to cost? Because they're paying for it.
Great. We have 5 more minutes, so if you have any questions, get ready. We have one online question from Jim. He asked, isn't it risky to convert housing to offices? And then he asks, doesn't it spark gentrification if you convert housing to offices?
Well, you could argue they're already converted to offices because how many of you guys work from home? Come on, you all work from home. You all work from home. You all have a computer at home. Yeah? You all work from home. You all draw at home. You all make calls to your colleagues at home, whether they're students or whether they're colleagues. So there's an overlap now that can never disappear, will never disappear. There used to be a division, but now there isn't a division. So we all have offices and homes that are... And actually, offices are safer than homes because people don't sleep in them, or generally speaking, don't sleep in them. So they are generally speaking. I don't think there's been a fatality in an office in the UK for 10 or 15. I could be wrong, but certainly in homes there is, because people are asleep. They're smoking a cigarette or whatever, and the place goes up. So I don't think it's an issue.
I think he asked about gentrification, whether it can...
Well, the gentrification, that's beyond even my magic powers. Look, it's inevitable that certain parts of town will go up and certain parts will go down. There's nothing you can do about that, except to say that probably the best parts of town rely on public realm, on clean streets, on parks, on greenery, on eyes on the street, and all of those are things that we as humans can provide. They don't. To give you an example, the best party you've ever been to was in somebody's flat when they were, packing cases. They were leaving to go to America, and there were some plastic cups with some wine, cheap wine bought in the supermarket. The worst party you went to was in a villa with, chandeliers and people serving. Human beings much prefer the conviviality of closeness, of connection, than, I'm sorry to say, than very formal architectural propositions. So
Okay.
I'm not worried about that.
Any more questions from the audience? We have one question here, front.
Yeah, hi. I want to touch on the thing we do is that we build districts to basically make cities bigger, but we don't really enable people to stay in those districts, and the districts just end up being where you sleep and you travel to work, which is usually done by public transport or your car, but people don't actually want to spend time where they live in these new districts because there's like no things to do culturally. There might be a restaurant, but what do you think we can do better when building these new places where people live to actually enable them to want to spend more time there?
I think you're right, and we're guilty of some of that, of building too many homes pro rata to social functions or cultural functions. It's very difficult when you've got a top-down model that a developer or a council will say, well, we've got to build 1,000 homes. We've got to get these people off the housing list, off the streets. We're going to build 1,000 homes. Let's just go for it. And actually, they can go to the pub somewhere else. And so I understand the question, and it does happen like that. You're right, it is like that. And the only thing I can suggest is that the people pay attention to that when the proposition, the planning proposition is to say, well, we want places for religious or cultural activity. We want loose-fit places we can inhabit and we can appropriate. I don't know the answer, but I think it's as important. You're right, and it's as important as parks. It really is the glue that holds people together. Now, the concept of a 15-minute city would if that is and there's nothing original about that. London is lots of 15-minute cities. But if you sort of embed that philosophy in planning, then and the planners say, okay, you're building 1,000 homes. Where's the cultural centre? Where's the gym? Where's the then you have a chance. But I think the other thing that is helping is that people are working from home a little bit as well.
Okay, we have a question over there.
Thank you. Alex, I enjoyed your talk. I lived in London for a number of years, and I felt that what you described in your talk didn't seem to connect with the reality that I experienced. And during your talk, I was trying to think of a sort of meaningful question to ask you, and I don't really have one, because it seems like everything that you're doing, although honourable, is kind of futile, because it isn't something that is accessible to the vast majority of people who live in the city and work in the city. And I just wondered, is there any kind of response that you would have to that? Because I feel like when you mentioned the Coin House building and the Oxo building and that kind of thing, I feel like that's just like a couple of floors in a city of 12 million people. And the reality of living in London or in a city, and increasingly actually, and for much of this audience will experience, that this is now something that has come to Prague, where there is increasing house prices, rent. People are starting to live in smaller and smaller spaces. Their quality of life is declining because of that. They don't have the advantage of your generation who were able to buy their own homes anymore, that the idea of home ownership is just a dream. Or if you are a single person, this is very pertinent for Valentine's night, if you're single, you're disadvantaged by being single, even though it may be your own choice. I just feel like, where does architecture come in to try and solve those issues? Because everything that you said tonight was great, but it just felt like it dissolved upon contact with reality.
Well, futility is something I specialize in. You know, it's not an easy path. And you can't expect as an architect to solve every problem. What you can perhaps do is you can show examples of how things could be done. That may be useful, because then people can say, well, it's been done. Let's try that. And some of the things that we do, you know, are exemplars. I wouldn't say all of them. I think you also slightly, how can I put it? Of course, it's all very hard, but believe me, it was hard in my generation. It's not like there was a golden age, you know, and I inhabited that golden age, and there's a few other older people, and it was just easy. We just walked into, it wasn't like that. I worked all the way through my education. You know, I had 2 jobs. I mean, it was not the, you know, I'm fortunate. I came from a middle-class family, but it was not easy to start an architectural practice. It was not easy to get our first client. Don't misunderstand that when you look at an old sort of rich guy like me, that it's just like, it was easy for all our generation. It wasn't. There's a huge fallout of people who, my late partner died 20 years ago of a heart attack because of the stress. So look, don't, you know, on the one hand, don't make it harder than it is. On the other hand, don't paint it that it's easier than it actually was. There has to be hope. And the hope has to be in all of you guys here thinking about the future. And if I say, you know, think about the investment of carbon in the future, nobody said that to me. You have that opportunity. Maybe it's too late for you. Maybe we fucked it up for you. But you have that opportunity. You have the opportunity to take from the examples that some of us tried to make and to build a better world. But it's not, nobody's going to give it to you. They just ain't. The world has always been tough, and it's getting tough. Actually, if you want to know how tough it is, look to Ukraine. Look to what the Russians did there. When my father lived in Poland in 1941, the Russians invaded on the last occasion. He lived in eastern Poland, which is now Ukraine, and he fled as a refugee. His life wasn't easy. So look, you know, I think you need a balance here. It is hard. It is often futile. There's a huge amount of wasted work in architecture. We had 9 architects today. 8 of them are going to have wasted their time at the end, because only one will win. So it's never going to be easy, and there's never a single path, but you have to hope. And I would say architecture is an ambitious enterprise. You cannot be an architect without being ambitious, because you have to hope for a better future. And the flip side of that is, again, John Kenneth Galbraith, who said, pessimism is the mark of a superior intellect. And I think you have that.
Thank you very much. Yes, can we get a mic here for Kes Christiansen?
I just wanted to say improvement is a cumulative result of innumerable futilities.
Yeah. And maybe we just add to that, you know, you have an architect, but you need partners, you need a planner that kind of plans the city and that makes the plan sensible and that doesn't forget the social functions and actually creates the possibility for these projects to come up. And you also need other players, the politicians, etc. So it's we can't blame the architect because the architect is very low. I started the anecdote about how I met Alex, and it was thanks to my friend from Korea. And he was an architect, and he realized he can't actually achieve what he wanted as an architect. So he became a planner, and then he realized he can't even achieve what he wanted as a planner. So he started to teach planning, because then he thought he will have the biggest impact, that he will teach planners, in Asia on how to plan cities. So I think there's also different roles, and you can't blame an architect for how the city looks because you are not so powerful.
I'm just sorry, I'm intrigued by a question because it's the first tough question I've had for a while. We came up with the idea of the Hungerford Bridge. We positioned that idea in the public consciousness, and then we gathered the interest and the sort of enthusiasm and the finance for it, and then we won the competition. And that was the only way. Before then, I don't know if you remember this, there was a 2-meter wide connection from north to south on one of the most popular routes. 2 meters wide. Even in 1845, there were two 2-meter wide bridges. And people were literally falling over themselves. We had 2 people from Oxo who were skateboarders. And they were walking along that bridge, and they met a gang of kids who were horrible kids who threw them over. One of them died. So it was a crime-ridden, horrible, narrow, miserable place. And the vision, if you want, it wasn't much of a vision because it's pretty obvious, maybe very obvious, but the vision and then the ability to push those ideas through made some improvement. As Keith says, a lot of futilities make for a better world. Otherwise, what we're going to do, we're going to slit our wrists. Well, I left and came to Prague. Yeah, but that's fine. But, you know, what happens...
building a bridge or whatever, but I mean, really what I want is some sort of architectural solution or maybe some kind of ideas of a different way of doing things, because the everything that's been described today is, again, like I don't want to pour cold water on the achievements that you've mentioned, because they are admirable, but a lot of the ideas that only exist within the existing system, and the existing system is no longer working for professional people who come into the city to work. And I feel that this is, the reason I'm asking this question is because I feel that it's no longer specific to London anymore. I feel it's also occurring in other cities in Europe, and definitely happening here in Prague. And the idea of dormant homes is very much an issue here. The apartment block where I live also has dormant homes. But some kind of other solution, because I wasn't living anywhere near that bridge that you described. I was out at Zone 5, you know, on the edge of the city, because that was the only place where I could afford to live. And I just feel like a lot of this talk is great, but it doesn't seem to relate to the real issues that people are experiencing when they're in a large city, capital city, such as Prague or London.
Okay. Just on the business of other systems, you may be right. There may be another system. We haven't discovered it yet. Again, to go back to John Kenneth Galbraith, he says capitalism is a system where man exploits man, and communism is the exact opposite. And you know, that's quite profound actually, because you know that's an issue we have. Everybody's exploiting everybody in whatever system you have. And we haven't yet come up with the right answer, particularly not when there's... I showed you how much population growth there is in London. I mean, that is unsustainable in 30 years. And why are they coming to London? Because they're coming for work. They're coming because, you know, there's a tolerant... You know, some things have improved. And when I you know, first came to London as a small boy, you know, homosexuality was, you know, it was like... So things do change, and they do change for the better. And I think somehow you have to map that at the same time as your despondency. And you know, I'm interested in despondency as well, because if everything was great, why would we bother? But somehow there's a way of navigating that. You know, it's personal.
Thank you.
I don't know how to do it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we had really a nice exchange in the end. No, it's good to ask these difficult questions. So, Alex, thank you very much for your amazing lecture and your sharing with us your experience and this great idea of architecture of time and flexibility of uses. Thank you very much. It was amazing. Thank you to your audience for staying with us until so late, despite it's Valentine's evening. We'll switch the lights off and and leave, so you can continue with the evening. And see you next time.